The morning fog clung to the streets of Charlottesville, Virginia, as Rebecca Torres unlocked the front door of the Historical Image Preservation Lab. It was early March 2025, and the cold still had teeth despite the approaching spring. Inside the lab, the familiar scent of archival materials and specialized cleaning solutions greeted her. Rebecca had been a photograph conservator for 12 years, and this small converted warehouse space had become her sanctuary, a place where the past revealed itself one carefully restored image at a time. She hung her jacket on the hook by the door and carried her coffee to her primary workstation, a custom-built desk equipped with high-powered magnification equipment, specialized lighting arrays, and a bank of monitors displaying various analytical software programs. On her desk sat a package that had arrived late yesterday afternoon, just as she was preparing to leave. She had resisted the temptation to open it then, knowing she would lose herself in the work and not get home until midnight. But now, with a full day ahead of her, she could give it her complete attention. The package came from an estate lawyer in Wise County, Virginia, deep in the Appalachian Mountains near the Kentucky border. The accompanying letter explained that the photograph had been discovered in a safe deposit box that hadn't been opened since 1952. The box belonged to the estate of Eleanor Kincaid, who had died at age 97 with no living descendants. The photograph appeared to be a wedding portrait from 1897, and the lawyer hoped Rebecca could restore it for inclusion in a regional historical archive. Rebecca carefully removed the protective wrapping, her experienced hands moving with practiced precision. Even through the layers of archival tissue paper, she could tell the photograph was in remarkable condition for its age. When she finally revealed it, she caught her breath. The image was stunning, a large-format portrait measuring 12 by 16 inches, printed on heavy albumin paper that had survived the decades with minimal fading. The photograph showed a wedding party arranged on the porch of a substantial house, the kind of dwelling that suggested prosperity unusual for the region and era. The bride stood at the center, wearing an elaborate white dress with leg-of-mutton sleeves and a high lace collar, her dark hair arranged in the Gibson girl style that was fashionable in the late 1890s. She held a bouquet of what appeared to be mountain laurel and wild roses. Her expression was solemn, as was typical for formal portraits of the era when subjects had to remain still for long exposures, but there was something else in her face, a tension that Rebecca had learned to recognize after years of studying historical photographs. The groom stood beside her, a tall man in his 30s wearing a dark suit that looked new and expensive. His hand rested possessively on the bride's shoulder. He had the weathered face of someone who worked outdoors, though his clothing suggested he had risen above manual labor. Behind them stood what appeared to be family members and wedding guests, about 15 people arranged in careful rows, all dressed in their finest clothes, all wearing expressions of forced formality that the long exposure times demanded. Rebecca began her standard documentation process, photographing the image from multiple angles under different lighting conditions before beginning any restoration work. She recorded the dimensions, noted the paper type and condition, documented any visible damage or deterioration. The photograph had some minor foxing along the edges, small brown spots caused by humidity and age, and there was slight silvering in the darkest areas, a common problem with albumin prints. But overall, it was in exceptional condition, probably because it had spent most of its existence in that sealed safe deposit box. She was adjusting her magnification equipment to begin a detailed surface examination when her assistant, David Chen, arrived. David was 28, recently graduated from a conservation program, enthusiastic and talented though still learning the subtleties of the craft. He had been working with Rebecca for 8 months, and she had come to trust his eye and his careful approach to delicate work. "That's beautiful," David said, leaning over her shoulder to look at the wedding portrait. "Late 19th century? The clothing suggests 1890s. 1897, according to the documentation," Rebecca confirmed. "Found in a safe deposit box in Wise County. The woman who owned it died in 1998, but the box hadn't been opened since 1952. So this image has been sealed away, protected from light and air, for over 70 years. That's why the condition is so good." David studied the photograph with interest. "Do we know who these people are? There's something about the composition that feels significant. Look at the spacing between the bride and groom, and the way the other people are positioned." It's almost like there are two separate groups rather than one unified wedding party. Rebecca had noticed the same thing but hadn't fully articulated it yet. Now that David pointed it out, it became more obvious. The people on the left side of the frame seemed to be associated with the groom, older, prosperous-looking, wearing expressions of satisfaction and pride. The people on the right, fewer in number, appeared younger and less comfortable, their clothing slightly less refined. They seemed to be keeping their distance from the groom's party, as if there were an invisible boundary running down the center of the photograph. "Good eye," Rebecca said. "Let me check the documentation again." She pulled out the letter from the estate lawyer and read through it more carefully. There was a note attached that she had only glanced at the previous evening. It was written in a shaky hand, probably by Eleanor Kincaid herself near the end of her life. Rebecca read it aloud to David. "This photograph must be preserved and eventually placed in a public archive. The truth about my mother's marriage must not be forgotten, though I could never speak of it while anyone who knew the family still lived. Look carefully at her left hand, at what she hides. That mark tells the real story. She was braver than anyone knew. She saved us all, though it cost her everything she wanted for herself. Her name was Margaret." Rebecca and David exchanged glances. The note suggested there was something hidden in the photograph, some detail that would reveal a secret Eleanor Kincaid had kept her entire life. Rebecca felt the familiar thrill of discovery, the sense that this restoration would be more than just technical work, that it would uncover a human story that someone had carefully preserved across more than a century. "Let's look at the bride's left hand," Rebecca said, adjusting her equipment to focus on that specific area of the photograph. Under standard lighting, the bride's hand was partially concealed by her bouquet, positioned naturally but in a way that made it difficult to see clearly. Rebecca switched to raking light, angling the illumination to reveal surface texture and details that might be invisible under normal conditions. "There," David said, pointing at the monitor where a magnified view of the bride's hand was displayed. "There's something there on the back of her hand. Some kind of discoloration or stain. It could be damage to the photograph, or it could be something on her actual hand that the camera captured." Rebecca switched to infrared imaging, a technique that could sometimes reveal details hidden by stains or discoloration in historical photographs. The infrared light penetrated the surface layers of the albumin print, showing the underlying image with remarkable clarity. What appeared under normal light as a vague brownish stain resolved itself into a distinct pattern under infrared examination. "It's not damage to the photograph," Rebecca said slowly, her heart rate increasing as she understood what she was seeing. "It's a marking on her actual hand. Look at the pattern. Those are letters or numbers. Some kind of identification mark or tattoo. It was deliberately concealed by her positioning of the bouquet, but the photographer captured it anyway, probably couldn't avoid it given the angle and lighting." David leaned in closer, studying the infrared image. "Can you make out what it says? The numbers are clearer than the letters." Rebecca began the painstaking process of enhancing the image, using multiple analytical techniques to extract as much information as possible from the faint marking. She worked for over an hour, trying different approaches, consulting reference materials about historical identification systems, comparing the marking to known examples from various institutions and organizations of the 1890s era. Finally, she sat back, her conclusion both certain and troubling. "It's an orphan asylum marking," she said quietly. "That's a registration number and facility identifier from the New York Foundling Hospital. They marked children who came through their system, usually with ink that was supposed to be temporary but sometimes left permanent stains. This particular marking system was used in the 1870s and early 1880s. David was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. So the bride in this photograph was an orphan from New York? But she's getting married in rural Virginia in 1897. How did she get from a New York orphanage to an Appalachian wedding? That's exactly what we need to find out, Rebecca said, her mind already racing ahead to the research that would be necessary. Eleanor Kincaid's note said her mother was brave, that she saved her family though it cost her everything she wanted. There's a story here, David, something important that Eleanor wanted preserved but couldn't tell while people who knew the truth were still alive. Our job is to restore more than just this photograph. We need to restore the truth it contains. They spent the rest of the day working on the technical restoration, carefully removing the foxing, correcting the silver mirroring, bringing the image as close as possible to its original appearance. But Rebecca's mind kept returning to that marking on Margaret's hand, to the mystery of how an orphan from New York had ended up married to a prosperous man in the Virginia mountains, and why Eleanor Kincaid had felt it necessary to keep the story secret for so long. That evening, after David had gone home, Rebecca remained at the lab, beginning her historical research. She started with the New York Foundling Hospital, accessing their digitized records through a historical database maintained by the New York Public Library. The hospital had been founded in 1869 by the Sisters of Charity to care for abandoned infants and children. They had developed an extensive system for placing children with families, including a controversial program that sent orphan trains west, distributing children to families throughout rural America. Rebecca searched the hospital's records for the specific identification number she had extracted from the photograph. It took nearly 2 hours of careful searching through poorly indexed documents, but she finally found the entry. Margaret Sullivan, admitted to the Foundling Hospital in 1873 at approximately age 3, parents unknown. The child had been found abandoned in a tenement building after a fire killed several residents. She was one of hundreds of children who flooded into the hospital during the difficult economic years following the Panic of 1873. The record showed that Margaret had remained at the hospital until 1882, when at age 12 she had been placed on an orphan train heading west. The destination was listed as rural Virginia, part of a program to place children with farming families who needed help with labor and were willing to take in orphans in exchange for their work. There was no record of which specific family Margaret had been placed with, just a notation that she had been assigned to the Appalachian region program. Rebecca sat back, beginning to piece together a possible narrative. Margaret had been an orphan train rider, one of the estimated 250,000 children who were transported from East Coast cities to rural areas between 1854 and 1929. Many of these children found loving homes and good lives. But many others were essentially used as indentured labor, worked hard by families who saw them as free help rather than as children who deserved care and education. The marking on Margaret's hand would have identified her as an orphan, a foundling with no family, no background, no social standing. In the rigidly class-conscious society of the 1890s, that mark would have been a source of shame, something to be hidden. Yet Margaret had married into what appeared to be a prosperous family. How had she overcome the stigma of her origin? And what had Eleanor meant when she said her mother had saved the family though it cost her everything she wanted? Rebecca knew she needed more information, local records from Wise County that might document Margaret's arrival and eventual marriage. She sent emails to 3 different historical societies in southwestern Virginia, explaining what she had discovered and asking for any records related to Margaret Sullivan or to the orphan train program in that region. Then she finally packed up her work and headed home, her mind full of questions and possibilities. Over the next week, Rebecca continued the technical restoration while simultaneously pursuing her historical research. The photograph was revealing its secrets slowly, each analytical technique providing new details. Under ultraviolet light, she discovered that the wedding dress had been altered, probably multiple times, suggesting it had been borrowed or handed down rather than made specifically for Margaret. There were also signs of hasty repairs in several places, as if the dress had been damaged shortly before the ceremony and quickly mended. The responses from the historical societies began arriving. The Wise County Historical Society sent a detailed email from their volunteer researcher, a retired schoolteacher named Patricia Mullins who had spent decades documenting local family histories. Patricia's email was thorough and enlightening, filling in crucial pieces of the story. According to Patricia's research, Margaret Sullivan had indeed arrived in Wise County on an orphan train in 1882, at age 12. She had been placed with the Thornton family, prosperous landowners who operated a large farm in the remote mountains near the Kentucky border. The Thorntons had taken in several orphan train children over the years, ostensibly to give them homes but primarily to use them as workers on their expanding farm operations. Margaret had worked for the Thorntons for 5 years, receiving minimal education and no wages. But in 1887, something had changed. Patricia's research, drawn from local newspaper archives and personal letters donated to the Historical Society, revealed that the Thornton family had fallen into financial difficulties. Poor harvests, bad investments, and expensive medical care for the patriarch of the family had depleted their resources. By 1896, they were facing the possibility of losing their land to creditors. The solution to their problems had come in the form of James Kincaid, a successful merchant from the nearby town of Norton. Kincaid was 42 years old, wealthy, respected, and widowed. He had no children from his first marriage and wanted a young wife who could provide him with heirs. The Thorntons, desperate to save their land, had arranged a marriage between Kincaid and Margaret, who was then 26 years old. But here's where it gets interesting. Patricia's email continued. I found letters from Sarah Thornton, the daughter of the family, written to a friend in Richmond. Sarah wrote that Margaret agreed to the marriage on the condition that Kincaid would pay off the Thornton family's debts. Essentially, Margaret sold herself into marriage to save the family she had been working for since age 12. But Sarah's letters suggest there was more to it than simple gratitude. Margaret apparently loved someone else, a young man from the area, but gave him up to fulfill her obligation to the Thorntons. Rebecca read this information with growing sadness and admiration. Margaret had been an orphan, a person with no social power, no family backing, no resources beyond her own labor. Yet she had chosen to sacrifice her own happiness to save the people who had taken her in, even though they had essentially used her as unpaid labor for years. The marking on her hand, the Foundling Hospital identification that she had tried to hide in the wedding photograph, was evidence of her powerlessness. But her actions revealed a different kind of power, the moral courage to do what she believed was right even at enormous personal cost. Did she have children? Rebecca emailed back to Patricia, eager to know the rest of Margaret's story. The response came quickly. Yes, one daughter, Eleanor, born in 1901 when Margaret was 31. James Kincaid died in 1919, leaving Margaret a widow at 49. According to the 1920 census, Margaret was still living in the Kincaid house, listed as head of household, with Eleanor and Eleanor's husband living with her. Margaret lived until 1942, dying at age 72. Eleanor never had children, and when she died in 1998, the family line ended. That's probably why the photograph ended up in a safe deposit box that nobody opened for decades. Rebecca shared all of this information with David the next morning. Together they studied the restored photograph with new understanding, seeing it not just as a wedding portrait but as a document of sacrifice and survival. The tension in Margaret's face made sense now. This was a woman entering a marriage she hadn't chosen, with a man she didn't love, to save people who had used her but whom she felt obligated to protect. Look at the people on the right side of the frame, David said, pointing to the monitor. Those must be the Thorntons. See how they're looking at Margaret? There's relief in their faces and maybe some guilt. They know what she's doing for them. Rebecca nodded, seeing it clearly now. The composition of the photograph, which had seemed odd at first, now revealed its meaning. The groom's party on the left represented the life Margaret was entering, prosperous and respectable but not chosen. The Thorntons on the right represented the life she was leaving behind, the people she was saving through her sacrifice. And Margaret stood between them, literally caught between two worlds, hiding the mark of her orphan past behind her bouquet while stepping into a future that would give her security and respect but not the love she had hoped for. We need to find out who the young man was, Rebecca said suddenly. The one Patricia mentioned that Margaret loved. He might be in this photograph. They studied the image carefully, looking at the younger men in the frame. There were three who appeared to be in their 20s or early 30s. One stood at the far right edge, partially turned away from the camera, his expression unreadable. Rebecca zoomed in on his face, enhancing the image to see his features more clearly. Look at how he's positioned, David observed. He's in the photograph, but barely. Like he wanted to be as far from the ceremony as possible while still being present. And see the way he's looking? Not at the camera, but at Margaret. He's the only person in the entire photograph who isn't looking at the camera or maintaining a neutral expression. He looks devastated. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. David was right. This young man, whoever he was, stood at the edge of the frame looking at the bride with such naked grief that it was painful to see. The photographer had captured him in a moment of unguarded emotion, and that moment had been preserved for more than a century, waiting for someone to notice it and understand what it meant. "I need to find out who he was," Rebecca said, her determination solidifying. "Margaret's story deserves to be fully told, and he's part of it." Rebecca's research intensified over the following weeks. She contacted Patricia Mullins directly, and the two women developed a collaborative relationship, sharing discoveries and theories as they each pursued different aspects of Margaret's story. Patricia had access to local records and could interview elderly residents who might have heard stories passed down through their families. Rebecca had the photograph and the technical expertise to extract information from it that might not be visible to the casual observer. Patricia began by trying to identify the young man at the edge of the photograph. She went through census records, property deeds, and local newspaper archives, looking for young men who had been associated with the Thornton family or who had lived in the area during the 1890s. She also reached out to the Wise County Genealogical Society, posting inquiries about families who had lived near the Thornton farm during that period. Meanwhile, Rebecca continued her technical analysis of the photograph. She had created a high-resolution digital scan that allowed her to examine every detail at extreme magnification. She studied the expressions of each person in the frame, the way they held themselves, the subtle body language that revealed relationships and tensions. She analyzed the clothing, the setting, the quality of light, trying to understand not just who these people were but what they were feeling at this moment that had been frozen in time. 3 weeks after Patricia began her search, she called Rebecca with exciting news. "I think I found him," Patricia said, her voice crackling slightly over the phone connection. His name was Thomas Walker. He was 28 in 1897, worked as a surveyor and occasional timber scout. His family had a small farm about 3 miles from the Thornton place. And here's the interesting part. Thomas's younger sister, Emily, was best friends with Sarah Thornton. That's how I made the connection. Emily kept a diary, and her descendants donated it to the Historical Society 10 years ago. I've been going through it, and Rebecca, there are multiple entries about Thomas and Margaret. Rebecca's heart was racing. What do they say? Emily writes that Thomas had been in love with Margaret for years, since she first came to work for the Thorntons as a child. But the Thorntons wouldn't allow any kind of relationship to develop because Margaret was an orphan with no prospects, and they had plans for her to help their family in other ways. According to Emily, Thomas had asked Margaret to run away with him, to go west where nobody knew about her background and they could start fresh. But Margaret refused because she felt obligated to the Thorntons. They had taken her in when she had nothing, and she believed she owed them her loyalty. So when the Thorntons arranged the marriage to Kincaid, Rebecca said slowly, working through the implications, Margaret agreed because it was a way to repay that obligation, even though it meant losing Thomas. Exactly, Patricia confirmed. And there's more. Emily wrote that Thomas was devastated. He attended the wedding because his family was invited and because he wanted to see Margaret one last time. But he left immediately after the ceremony, took a job with a timber company in Oregon, and moved west. Emily was heartbroken about her brother leaving, and angry at the Thorntons for destroying her brother's happiness and Margaret's. Rebecca thought about the young man at the edge of the photograph, about the grief visible in his face. Did Thomas ever marry? Did he come back? Not according to what I've found so far, Patricia said. I'm still searching for records. He might have died young, or he might have stayed in Oregon and built a life out there. But I haven't found evidence of him returning to Virginia or marrying. It's like he disappeared from the historical record after 1897. That evening, Rebecca stayed late at the lab again, staring at the enhanced image of Thomas Walker's face. She thought about the two people in this photograph who had loved each other but been separated by circumstances and obligations, by Margaret's powerlessness as an orphan and the social conventions that allowed families like the Thorntons to essentially barter human lives to solve their financial problems. The photograph that had seemed like a straightforward wedding portrait had revealed itself to be a document of heartbreak, of impossible choices, of people trapped by circumstances beyond their control. But Rebecca kept thinking about Eleanor's note. She was braver than anyone knew. She saved us all, though it cost her everything she wanted for herself. There had to be more to the story. Margaret had married Kincaid, had borne his child, had lived as his wife for 22 years until his death. But what had happened after that? Had she found any happiness? Had there been any resolution to her sacrifice? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Patricia called 2 weeks later with extraordinary news. "Rebecca, you're not going to believe what I found. The old Kincaid house, the one where Margaret lived after her marriage, it's been vacant for years. The town of Norton bought it with plans to turn it into a museum, but they ran out of funding. It's been sitting empty, slowly deteriorating. I got permission to go inside with a team from the Historical Society to document the house before it's too late. And we found something incredible." Rebecca waited, almost unable to breathe. "There are letters hidden in the walls," Patricia continued, her excitement palpable even over the phone. "Someone, probably Margaret, removed some of the plaster behind a loose board in what must have been her bedroom, and she stored letters there. We found over 50 of them, all exchanged between Margaret and Thomas. Rebecca, they never stopped writing to each other. For more than 40 years, they maintained a secret correspondence." Rebecca sat down heavily, overwhelmed by the significance of this discovery. 40 years? You mean even after Margaret married Kincaid? The letters start in 1897, right after the wedding. Thomas wrote to Margaret from Oregon, and she wrote back. They couldn't be together, couldn't have the life they wanted, but they stayed connected through letters. It's one of the most moving things I've ever read. The letters are careful, always respectful of Margaret's marriage, never suggesting anything inappropriate. But the love and longing in them is unmistakable. They shared their lives with each other through words, talking about their daily experiences, their thoughts, their feelings. It was the only way they could remain part of each other's lives. Patricia arranged for Rebecca to see the letters the following week. Rebecca drove to Norton, a 5-hour journey through the mountains that gave her time to think about Margaret and Thomas, about the life they could have had together and the shadow life they had created through correspondence instead. The letters had been carefully preserved by the Historical Society, placed in archival sleeves and organized chronologically. Rebecca spent 2 days reading through them, taking careful notes, occasionally stopping to wipe tears from her eyes. The letters painted a rich picture of two people who had never stopped loving each other but who had chosen duty and responsibility over personal happiness. Thomas's letters from Oregon described his work with timber companies, his wandering life in logging camps and frontier towns, his loneliness and sense of displacement. Margaret's letters described her marriage to James Kincaid with careful neutrality, never complaining but never pretending to any happiness she didn't feel. She wrote about the birth of Eleanor, about her joy in her daughter, about her determination to give Eleanor the education and opportunities she herself had never had. But running through all the letters, like a river underneath ice, was the constant current of their love for each other. They were careful never to say anything that would be truly improper for a married woman and a bachelor, but their affection was evident in every line. Thomas wrote about how he thought of Margaret when he saw beautiful landscapes, how he imagined showing her the mountains and forests of the Pacific Northwest. Margaret wrote about how Thomas's letters were the brightest points in her weeks, how she kept them hidden and read them when she needed strength. The most significant letters came after James Kincaid's death in 1919. Thomas, by then 50 years old, wrote to Margaret suggesting that perhaps now they could finally be together. He offered to come back to Virginia, to court her properly, to finally have the life they had been denied in their youth. Margaret's response was both heartbreaking and revealing. She wrote that she was honored and still loved him, but that she couldn't abandon Eleanor and her new husband who were depending on her. More than that, she wrote that she had built a life in Norton, had become respected in the community despite her origins as an orphan, and that starting over at 50 felt impossible. She asked Thomas if they could continue as they were, connected through letters, part of each other's lives even if they couldn't be physically together. Thomas agreed, and the letters continued for another 13 years, until Thomas's death in 1932. His final letter, written when he was clearly very ill, told Margaret that loving her had been the defining fact of his life, that even though they had never had the life together they had dreamed of, knowing she existed and that she cared for him had made everything worthwhile. Margaret's letter in response, which was found with the others though it had never been sent because Thomas died before receiving it, expressed similar sentiments. She wrote that their love had been real and important even though it had never been conventionally fulfilled, that sometimes the most meaningful relationships were the ones that existed in spite of obstacles rather than because everything had been easy. Rebecca finished reading the letters in Patricia's small office at the Historical Society, both women sitting in silence for a long moment after the last page. Finally, Patricia spoke. Eleanor must have found these letters after Margaret died in 1942. That's probably why she put the wedding photograph in a safe deposit box with that note. She wanted the truth preserved but couldn't tell it while anyone who knew the people involved was still alive. By sealing it away, she ensured it would eventually be discovered and understood. Margaret was braver than anyone knew, Rebecca said softly, echoing Eleanor's words. She gave up her own happiness to save the Thornton family, married a man she didn't love, bore his child, and lived respectably for more than 40 years. But she also maintained her own private rebellion, her secret connection to the man she really loved. She couldn't have the life she wanted, so she created what space for herself she could. Patricia nodded. And the marking on her hand, the Foundling Hospital identification she tried to hide in the wedding photograph, it becomes even more significant knowing the full story. That mark represented her powerlessness, her status as someone without family or social standing, someone whose life could be arranged by others to suit their needs. But her relationship with Thomas, maintained in secret for decades, was her way of asserting that she was more than that mark suggested, that she had her own will and her own capacity to love and choose, even if those choices had to be made in secret. Rebecca returned to Charlottesville with copies of selected letters, scanned and digitized with permission from the Historical Society. She and David spent the next month creating a comprehensive exhibition proposal that would feature the wedding photograph alongside the story they had uncovered. They enlarged sections of the photograph to show crucial details: the marking on Margaret's hand, Thomas's grief-stricken face at the edge of the frame, the tension visible in Margaret's posture, the relief and guilt in the Thorntons' expressions. They also included excerpts from the letters, carefully selected to tell the story without violating the intimacy of the correspondence. The goal was to show the arc of Margaret and Thomas's relationship, from their early love to their forced separation to their decades-long written connection to their final affirmations of devotion despite never having had the conventional life together they had dreamed of. The Appalachian Heritage Center in Abingdon, Virginia agreed to host the exhibition. They recognized the significance of Margaret's story, not just as personal history but as a window into the larger social dynamics of late 19th and early 20th century Appalachia. The exhibition was titled Hidden Hearts: An Orphan Train Bride and Her Secret Love, and it was scheduled to open in September 2025. As the opening date approached, Rebecca found herself thinking constantly about Margaret and Thomas. She had spent so much time with their story, with the photograph and the letters, that they felt real to her in a way that historical figures rarely did. She imagined Margaret as a young woman, arriving in Virginia on an orphan train, marked with the identification number that branded her as someone without family or status. She imagined the years of work on the Thornton farm, the growing love between Margaret and Thomas, the moment when Margaret learned she was being married off to save the family she had served for so long. Most powerfully, Rebecca imagined the moments when Margaret wrote her letters to Thomas, stealing time from her duties as James Kincaid's wife to maintain her connection to the man she truly loved. Those letters had been Margaret's private rebellion, her way of keeping alive the part of herself that couldn't be controlled or arranged by others. They were evidence that even in circumstances of extreme powerlessness, people found ways to assert their humanity, to claim space for themselves, to love despite all obstacles. David helped design the physical exhibition, creating a layout that would guide visitors through the story chronologically. The centerpiece was the restored wedding photograph, mounted at eye level and beautifully lit. Around it were arranged enlargements of crucial details, accompanied by explanatory text that told Margaret's story. A separate section featured facsimiles of selected letters, allowing visitors to see the actual handwriting and paper, to understand the physicality of how Margaret and Thomas maintained their connection across distance and decades. Patricia Mullins contributed historical context panels that explain the orphan train program, the social dynamics of Appalachian communities in the late 19th century, and the limited options available to women, especially women without family connections or property. She also created a family tree showing what had happened to the various people in the photograph, documenting their lives and deaths and demonstrating how Margaret's sacrifice had indeed saved the Thornton family from financial ruin. The exhibition also addressed the marking on Margaret's hand directly, with a detailed explanation of the Foundling Hospital identification system and what such markings meant for the children who bore them. This section included photographs and documents from other orphans, showing how common such markings were and how they affected the children's lives long after they had left institutional care. The goal was to help modern viewers understand the stigma Margaret had lived with, the way she had been branded as someone without legitimate family or social standing. But the most powerful element of the exhibition, the one that consistently made visitors pause and reflect, was a side-by-side comparison of two letters. On the left was Thomas's letter from 1897, written just after the wedding, expressing his heartbreak and asking Margaret if she had made the right choice. On the right was Margaret's response from 1919, written just after James Kincaid's death, when she explained to Thomas why she couldn't leave Norton to be with him despite now being free to do so. Reading these letters together, visitors could see the entire arc of their relationship, from young love to mature acceptance, from the grief of separation to the quiet dignity of a love maintained across impossible distances. The exhibition opened on a beautiful September evening. The Heritage Center had publicized the event extensively, and more than 200 people attended the opening reception. Local historians mixed with descendants of Appalachian families, orphan train researchers, and people interested in women's history. Patricia Mullins had driven in from Wise County, bringing several elderly residents who had heard family stories about the Thorntons and Kincaids and wanted to see the photographic evidence of events their grandparents had witnessed. Rebecca gave a short presentation about the technical aspects of the restoration and how she had discovered the marking on Margaret's hand. She explained the various analytical techniques she had used, showing before and after images that demonstrated how hidden details could be revealed through careful examination. But she also talked about the responsibility that came with such discoveries, the obligation to treat the people in historical photographs as human beings with complex lives and feelings rather than just as subjects to be studied. Patricia spoke next, providing the historical context and sharing some of the more moving passages from the letters. She talked about the orphan train program and its mixed legacy, acknowledging that while some children found loving homes, many others experienced exploitation and hardship. She also discussed the arranged marriage system that had been common in many communities, where economic considerations often outweighed personal feelings, especially for women without economic resources of their own. But the most moving moment came when a woman in her 70s approached Rebecca after the formal presentations had ended. She introduced herself as Helen Walker, Thomas Walker's great-niece. She had heard family stories about Thomas, about how he had gone west after a heartbreak and never married, but she had never known the full story until she read about the exhibition in the newspaper. "My grandmother Emily's diary is mentioned in your research," Helen said, her voice emotional. Emily was Thomas's sister. She used to tell my mother stories about Thomas and the woman he loved but couldn't have. We always wondered who she was and what happened. Now we know. And I'm so grateful that their story is being told. Thomas was a good man. He deserved to be remembered, and so did Margaret. Helen had brought something with her, a small photograph in a worn leather case. She opened it carefully and showed it to Rebecca. It was a portrait of a young man, clearly the same person who appeared at the edge of the wedding photograph, but this image showed him before the heartbreak, smiling slightly, his eyes bright with hope and life. "This is Thomas at 25, Helen said. "My great-grandmother kept it. When Emily died, my mother inherited it along with the diary and other family things. We always treasured it because there are so few photographs of Thomas. He didn't like having his picture taken. I'd like to donate this to the exhibition if you think it would be appropriate. I think people should see what he looked like when he was happy, before his heart was broken." Rebecca accepted the photograph with trembling hands, Moved by the generosity of this gesture and by the way Margaret and Thomas's story continued to resonate across generations. The photograph was added to the exhibition the next day, placed near the wedding portrait so visitors could see Thomas at two moments in his life, young and hopeful, then older and grief-stricken at the loss of his love. Over the following weeks, the exhibition drew steady crowds. Visitors spent long periods reading the letters, studying the details of the wedding photograph, reflecting on the choices Margaret and Thomas had made. The guest book filled with comments from people who were moved by the story, who saw parallels to their own experiences of love and loss, who appreciated the way the exhibition honored the complexity of human relationships. Rebecca received numerous messages from researchers interested in similar stories, from descendants of other orphan train riders wanting to learn more about their ancestors, from people working on projects related to arranged marriages or economic exploitation of vulnerable populations. The exhibition had touched something broader than just Margaret and Thomas's individual story. It had opened a window into a whole category of human experience that had often been hidden or forgotten, the private emotional lives of people who lived under circumstances that left them little room for personal choice or self-determination. One particularly significant visitor was Dr. Rachel Morrison, a historian at the University of Virginia who specialized in orphan train history. She spent hours at the exhibition, taking detailed notes, studying the letters, and examining the photograph under the excellent lighting Rebecca had specified. Afterward, she contacted Rebecca directly. "This is one of the most complete orphan train stories I've ever encountered," Dr. Morrison said during their phone conversation. "We have plenty of general records about the program, lots of statistics and official documents. But we rarely get such intimate access to what it actually felt like to be an orphan train rider, to live with the stigma and limitations that status imposed. And the letters between Margaret and Thomas are extraordinary. They show something that's often missing from historical narratives: the emotional interior lives of ordinary people dealing with extraordinary circumstances." Dr. Morrison proposed writing an academic article about Margaret's story for a journal focused on social history. She also suggested that the exhibition could travel to other venues, particularly to places involved in the orphan train program like New York, where the system had originated. Rebecca enthusiastically supported both ideas, seeing them as ways to ensure that Margaret and Thomas's story would reach even more people and contribute to a fuller understanding of this important but often overlooked aspect of American history. The exhibition remained open through the winter, drawing visitors despite the cold and occasional snow. In January 2026, Rebecca returned to the Heritage Center for a symposium on orphan train history that had been organized in response to the exhibition's success. Scholars, descendants, and social workers gathered to discuss the program's legacy and its relevance to contemporary issues like foster care and adoption. Rebecca participated in a panel about the use of photographs and personal documents in historical research. She talked about the technical process of discovering the marking on Margaret's hand, but she also emphasized the interpretive work that had been necessary to understand what that marking meant and how it had shaped Margaret's life. She argued that restoration work was never purely technical, that it always involved human interpretation and required an empathetic engagement with the people whose images were being preserved. During the symposium, several descendants of orphan train riders came forward with their own family photographs, asking Rebecca if she could examine them for hidden details or overlooked clues that might reveal more about their ancestors' experiences. She agreed to look at several of them, recognizing that Margaret's story had opened up possibilities for many people to recover and understand their own family histories more fully. One of these photographs proved particularly significant. It showed a group of children standing beside a train, clearly orphans being transported west as part of the program. In the crowd of children, Rebecca spotted markings on several hands similar to what she had found on Margaret's. By enhancing these details and comparing them to Foundling Hospital records, she was able to identify several of the children and trace what had happened to them after they left New York. This discovery led to several families reconnecting with their orphan train heritage and learning details about their ancestors that had been lost for generations. As winter turned to spring in 2026, Rebecca found herself reflecting on how much her own life had been changed by the discovery of Margaret's story. The technical challenge of revealing the marking on Margaret's hand had been interesting, but it was the human story behind that marking that had truly captivated her. She had spent her entire career preserving historical images, but Margaret's photograph had taught her that preservation was about more than just maintaining physical objects. It was about recovering voices, honoring sacrifices, and ensuring that people who had lived with courage and dignity in difficult circumstances would not be forgotten. The exhibition had been so successful that the Heritage Center made it a permanent installation, dedicating an entire gallery to Margaret and Thomas's story. Additional materials continued to be added as researchers discovered new details. Patricia Mullins had found more letters in attics and storage boxes belonging to various descendants of the families involved. Each new discovery added depth and nuance to the story, revealing more about the social world Margaret had navigated and the choices she had made within the limited options available to her. One particularly moving addition came from an unexpected source. A woman named Catherine Brennan contacted the Heritage Center with information about her great-grandmother, who had been one of the Thornton daughters visible in the wedding photograph. Catherine had been going through family papers after her mother's death and had found a diary kept by her great-grandmother in the early 1900s. The diary contained several entries about Margaret, reflecting on the sacrifice Margaret had made to save the Thornton family and expressing both gratitude and guilt. We used her. One entry read, written in 1905. We told ourselves it was a good match, that she would be better off married to a prosperous man than working as a domestic helper. But the truth is we were desperate and she was powerless to refuse us. I think about her often, wonder if she is happy, hope that she has found some contentment in her life. She deserved so much better than what we gave her. Another entry, from 1919, mentioned hearing about James Kincaid's death. I learned today that James Kincaid has died. I find myself hoping that Margaret, now free of a marriage she never chose, might find some happiness. She would be nearly 50 now, still young enough to have some years of peace. I wish I had the courage to contact her, to apologize for what my family did. But too much time has passed, and I fear any attempt at reconciliation would only reopen old wounds. These diary entries were added to the exhibition, providing yet another perspective on Margaret's story. They showed that at least some members of the Thornton family had understood the moral complexity of what they had done, had recognized that in saving themselves they had sacrificed Margaret's autonomy and happiness. The fact that this guilt had been carried for decades, expressed only in private diary entries, spoke to the way these arranged marriages functioned. Everyone involved understood what was happening, but social conventions required them to maintain the fiction that it was all proper and appropriate. Rebecca also received an extraordinary piece of news from Patricia Mullins. Patricia had continued searching for information about Thomas Walker's life in Oregon, and she had finally located his death certificate and obituary from 1932. The obituary, published in a small Oregon newspaper, described Thomas as a surveyor and timber scout known for his extensive knowledge of the Pacific Northwest forests. It mentioned that he had never married and had no children, but it also included a detail that brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. Mr. Walker requested that his personal effects be sent to an address in Virginia, to a woman he described as his dearest friend. Patricia had tracked down the shipment through shipping records and had discovered that Thomas had sent Margaret a package just before his death. The contents, according to the shipping manifest, included personal papers and a small wooden box. Patricia had been unable to locate these items initially, but then she remembered something. Eleanor Kincaid, Margaret's daughter, had donated several boxes of her mother's belongings to the Wise County Historical Society in the 1980s. These boxes had been cursorily inventoried but never fully examined because they had seemed to contain mainly everyday household items. Patricia went back through these boxes with new purpose, and she found what she was looking for. Wrapped in cloth and tucked into a larger box of linens was a small carved wooden box, beautifully made with intricate designs of mountains and trees. Inside the box were Thomas's letters to Margaret, carefully preserved and arranged chronologically, along with a final letter written shortly before his death. This last letter was different from all the others. Thomas wrote about his life with complete honesty, acknowledging that never marrying had been a choice, that he had never wanted anyone but Margaret even though he had known for more than 30 years that they would never be together in the conventional sense. He thanked her for the letters, for the connection that had sustained him through decades of wandering and loneliness. And then he wrote something that transformed the entire story. "You once told me that you couldn't come to me after James died because you had obligations to Eleanor and because you had built a life in Norton that you couldn't abandon," Thomas wrote. "I understood and accepted your decision. But I want you to know that I never regretted loving you, even though that love was never fulfilled in the way we dreamed when we were young. Some people might pity us, might say we wasted our lives on an impossible relationship. But I don't see it that way. Loving you, knowing you loved me, staying connected through letters across all these years, it gave my life meaning and purpose. It made me a better person. If I could go back and choose differently, choose not to love you to save myself the pain of separation, I wouldn't do it. The love was worth it, even with all the hardship. Especially with all the hardship." He concluded, "I am sending you these letters because they belong to you, just as your letters to me have always belonged to me. They are the record of our life together, the life we created through words when circumstances wouldn't allow us anything else. Keep them safe. Perhaps someday someone will find them and understand that love isn't measured by whether two people lived in the same house or shared the same name. Love is measured by faithfulness, by the choice to remain connected even when everything argues for separation. We loved truly, Margaret. That's all that matters." Rebecca stood in Patricia's office, reading this letter with tears streaming down her face. David, who had driven down to Wise County with her, was equally moved. They both understood that this letter transformed Margaret and Thomas's story from one of pure tragedy to something more complex and ultimately more affirming. Yes, they had been separated by circumstances and convention. Yes, they had been denied the conventional life together they had wanted in their youth. But they had created something else instead. A relationship sustained by choice rather than proximity, by emotional intimacy rather than physical presence, by the determination to remain connected even when every practical consideration argued for letting go. "This changes the exhibition," Rebecca said finally, wiping her eyes. "This letter needs to be the conclusion, the final word on their relationship. It shows that despite everything, despite all the obstacles and heartbreak, they won. They created the relationship they needed on the terms available to them. That's not tragic. That's triumphant." The letter and the carved wooden box were added to the exhibition within a month. The Heritage Center created a new final section titled, "A Life Shared in Letters," featuring Thomas's last letter alongside photographs of the box he had carved and sent to Margaret. The response from visitors was overwhelming. People who had seen the exhibition before returned to see this new edition, and many reported that it changed their entire understanding of the story. What had seemed like a tale of thwarted love revealed itself to be something more nuanced, a demonstration that human connection could survive and even flourish under circumstances that should have destroyed it. Rebecca was invited to speak at conferences about the restoration project and its discoveries. She talked about the technical aspects of revealing hidden details in historical photographs, but she always emphasized that the technical work was in service of recovering human stories. She used Margaret and Thomas's story to illustrate the importance of looking beyond surface appearances, of investigating anomalies rather than dismissing them, of treating historical subjects as people with complex emotional lives rather than as mere data points. Dr. Morrison completed her academic article about Margaret's story, and it was published in a prestigious historical journal. The article sparked significant academic interest, leading to new research projects about orphan train experiences and about the emotional lives of people living under arranged marriage systems. Several graduate students chose to write dissertations expanding on themes raised by Margaret's story, examining how people in constrained circumstances found ways to assert agency and maintain emotional autonomy. But perhaps the most significant development came from a completely unexpected direction. A television producer contacted Rebecca about developing Margaret and Thomas's story into a documentary. The producer had visited the exhibition and been deeply moved by the relationship sustained through letters, by the way Margaret and Thomas had created a space for authentic connection despite all obstacles. The documentary proposal emphasized the contemporary relevance of the story, drawing parallels to modern long-distance relationships and to the ways people today maintain connections through technology across great distances. Rebecca agreed to participate, seeing the documentary as another way to ensure that Margaret and Thomas's voices would be heard, that their choices and sacrifices would be understood and honored. The filming took place over several months, with Rebecca, Patricia, Dr. Morrison, and several descendants all contributing interviews and perspectives. Helen Walker spoke movingly about her great-uncle Thomas and how learning his complete story had changed her understanding of family history. Catherine Brennan discussed her great-grandmother's guilt and what that revealed about how people justified arranged marriages even when they understood the human cost. The documentary aired on a major streaming platform in early 2027 and was viewed by millions of people. It sparked discussions on social media about love, sacrifice, obligation, and the choices people make when circumstances limit their options. Thousands of viewers commented on how the story had moved them, how it had made them think differently about their own relationships and the constraints they lived with. Many people shared their own family stories of arranged marriages, of loves given up for practical reasons, of relationships sustained across distance through letters or other means. Rebecca watched the documentary alone in her apartment, feeling a deep sense of completion. The photograph that had arrived at her lab nearly 2 years earlier had seemed like a straightforward restoration project. But by paying attention to a small anomaly, a stain beneath a bride's hand that didn't quite make sense, she had uncovered a story that resonated across more than a century. Margaret's courage in sacrificing her own happiness to save others, Thomas's faithful love sustained across decades and distance, their shared determination to remain connected even when conventions said they should accept separation, all of this spoke to fundamental human experiences that transcended time and culture. Several months after the documentary aired, Rebecca received a letter from a viewer. The woman explained that she was in a long-distance relationship, separated from the man she loved by circumstances beyond their control. She had been considering ending the relationship because it seemed pointless to continue when they couldn't be together physically. But after watching the documentary about Margaret and Thomas, she had changed her mind. I realized that what makes a relationship meaningful isn't physical proximity or conventional markers like marriage and cohabitation, the woman wrote. It's the choice to remain connected, to share your life with someone through whatever means are available. Margaret and Thomas showed me that love sustained by choice and maintained through effort is just as real and valuable as any other kind of love. Thank you for uncovering their story and sharing it. It has genuinely changed my life. Rebecca kept this letter in a frame on her desk, a reminder that the work of preservation and restoration could have impacts far beyond what she might imagine. By revealing the marking on Margaret's hand, by uncovering the story hidden in that small detail, she had helped bring forward voices that deserve to be heard. Margaret and Thomas had been ordinary people living in difficult circumstances, but their choices to love faithfully, to maintain connection across impossible distances, to create meaning in their lives despite all obstacles, these were extraordinary acts of human will and dignity. The exhibition continued to evolve. New materials kept being discovered as descendants learned about the project and searched through their own family archives. Each new letter, photograph, or diary entry added another piece to the puzzle, another dimension to the story. Rebecca understood that the work of historical recovery was never truly finished, that there would always be more to learn, more voices to hear, more stories to uncover. On the second anniversary of the exhibition's opening, the Heritage Center organized a special commemoration. Rebecca, Patricia, David, and numerous descendants gathered to reflect on what had been learned and achieved. They stood together in the gallery, looking at the enlarged wedding photograph with its revealed secrets, at the letters arranged chronologically showing a relationship sustained across 4 decades, at the carved wooden box Thomas had made for Margaret, at all the material evidence of 2 lives lived with courage and faithfulness. Rebecca thought about how she had first seen this photograph, how the anomaly of the stain beneath Margaret's hand had caught her attention and refused to let go. She thought about the layers of meaning that had gradually revealed themselves, the orphan train marking that represented Margaret's powerless beginnings, the arranged marriage that had sacrificed her happiness for others' benefit, the secret correspondence that had allowed her to maintain connection with the man she truly loved, the lifetime of quiet dignity and eventual peace she had built despite all obstacles. They lived meaningful lives, Rebecca said to the group assembled in the gallery. That's what this exhibition ultimately demonstrates. Margaret and Thomas didn't get the conventional happy ending they wanted when they were young. But they got something else. A relationship built on choice and sustained by determination, a love that endured across distance and decades, a shared life created through words when physical presence wasn't possible. They showed that people can find ways to assert their humanity even in circumstances designed to constrain them. That's a story worth preserving. That's a story worth telling. The group agreed, and they spent the evening sharing reflections about what Margaret and Thomas's story meant to them. For some, it was a reminder of their own family histories and the sacrifices previous generations had made. For others, it was an illustration of how resilience and faithfulness could triumph over hardship. For all of them, it was proof that paying attention to small details, investigating anomalies, refusing to accept surface appearances, could reveal profound truths about human experience. As the evening ended and people began leaving the gallery, Rebecca remained behind for a few moments, alone with the photograph. She looked at Margaret's face, at the tension and determination visible there, at the hand positioned to hide the orphan marking while holding the bouquet that symbolized a marriage she hadn't chosen. She looked at Thomas at the edge of the frame, grief-stricken but present, bearing witness to the loss of his love even though it cost him everything to see her marry another man. "I understand now," Rebecca whispered to the photograph. "You were both so brave. You created meaning and beauty in circumstances that should have destroyed you. Thank you for leaving evidence, for preserving your story. Thank you for showing us that love and dignity can survive anything if we're determined enough to fight for them." She turned off the gallery lights and left, the photograph remaining in the darkness, its secrets revealed but its power undiminished. Margaret and Thomas's story would continue to speak to visitors, to move people, to inspire reflection about love and sacrifice and the choices we make when circumstances limit our options. The stain beneath the bride's hand had been revealed, the hidden marking exposed, the full story uncovered. And in that uncovering, two ordinary people who had lived more than a century ago had been given the immortality they deserved, their voices heard across time, their love recognized and honored, their courage acknowledged and celebrated.